Okay. So, welcome to another episode of Learning for Truth and Love. Um, it's been a little bit since we did meet, but I'm truly excited to that we can meet our guest today, Miss Tara Harrison. She and I met because of some courses, I should say some classes that I'm doing with homeschooling students based on the curricula that I'm designing and creating and testing out. And so I'm excited to have you today as a guest. Um, I want to say to everyone that one of the reasons I wanted to invite you um, is because when it comes to really understanding what we need as a community, as a Black community, what we need for our children, it's a discussion I do want to continue to have. And I just want to talk about, and you have come from so many different walks, and I'd love to touch on just about all of them today, including your role as a parent, teacher, as well as you were a classroom teacher and as an author, of your book. So, welcome.
Thank
So
you.
let's
Thank
begin.
you.
So let's start by, telling people about yourself, and then we'll go from there.
Okay. Well, my name is Tara Harrison. However, for my author name is LT Harrison, just a play of my middle and first name. And I've been born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland. And I have one son that I do homeschool. And before that, I was a classroom teacher, a public school teacher, and I've been a public school teacher here in Maryland. I've also taught in Texas and California, but most of my teaching experience came in Maryland. And I taught up until I had my son. And then when I had my son, I went on leave and then eventually resigned so I could raise him full time and now homeschool him full time.
Wow. That's quite a journey already, even though you haven't got into it. So I'm curious about your homeschooling journey. Just what led you to do that. Even having been, a classroom teacher. Tell us about your homeschooling journey and what you've done. Yeah.
Well, I kind of always was interested in homeschool. One of my closest friends has homeschooled all six of her children, and she's taken different
Mm.
paths on that homeschool journey. And she started off as a public school educator like myself, but she
Mm-hmm.
homeschooled her children from the beginning. So I always had her to talk to about it. And there were certain things that just kind of interested me. And then when I had my son, I thought about it. I wasn't sure what type of schooling he would go to. I was
Mm-hmm.
interested in the private school sector, but as you know, private school is very expensive and it just wasn't in the cards for us. So I just was thinking, where is he going to go to school? I know for those early pre-K, kindergarten type years, it's best to be in a smaller environment and for the
Mm-hmm.
children to learn through play.
Yeah.
And I just knew that in the public school sector, you often have large classes, not enough
Mm-hmm.
assistants. In a lot of the schools that I taught, a lot of times there was one assistant for 4 kindergarten classes. So
Wow.
I just knew that I wanted something different for my son. I know that he's, full of life, full of energy, and he needed to be able to get that out through most of the school day. So I did find a nature type preschool for him where he went part-time. And so that was
Mm-hmm.
good because they spent a lot of time outside. He got to move around. And I really liked that atmosphere. They believe in learning through nature and play and things of that nature. And
Mm-hmm.
then halfway through his preschool journey, we had COVID. And so then, we were forced to stay home. But at that time, he was about to go to preschool um, a little bit more full time, like 3 days a week, all day, but still at the nature preschool. Well, now
Mm-hmm.
we're home. He turned 5 during COVID. In our state at 5, they need to be enrolled in school. And so
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about, we were coming out of COVID, kind of like treading lightly. People were still
Mm-hmm.
online. And I told my partner, Damon's dad, let's try homeschooling.
Mm-hmm.
I have a lot of resources through my friends that I know
Mm-hmm.
that homeschooled. And so let's try it. And so he was like, okay, let's try it. So that's kind of how we started on this homeschooling journey.
Wow. It's funny to hear how you're thinking too. I think, having been in the classroom myself, you realize because you've been in the classroom, there are things that you look for, that's very specific, especially even knowing the value of play. As a matter of fact, even knowing that value is one of the reasons I took my son out of one elementary school. I was looking at not just the fact that they're playing, but what they were playing with, right? And how you
Right.
play and what you're playing with does make a difference. So if you can tell us some of the things you've done, as you went through with him, starting from at home to preschool, when you decide not to send him back, what are some things you did as a homeschooling parent to educate him?
Well, in the beginning, of course, it was trial and error, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of different resources out there. A lot more people are homeschooling. So there are a lot of people offering many different programs, many different things. But
Mm-hmm.
of course, all of these programs and things aren't what they seem, right? So we've
Mm-hmm.
tried some things and realized either they weren't greatly developed or weren't a good
Mm-hmm.
fit. So it definitely was a lot of trial and error. Also, just, he was still young. So
Mm-hmm.
the library was our place. We got a lot of our books from the library, and I read to him a lot. And we had a lot of discussions about different topics or people
Mm-hmm.
from those books that we would get from the library. And
Mm-hmm.
then, my friend was like, I needed to get on all the homeschooling groups on Facebook. So I did
Mm-hmm.
that, joined, a plethora of groups on Facebook. And so, of course, there were different meetups and
Mm-hmm.
different things on Facebook. And so, there was one meetup. We met
Mm-hmm.
at a park that had some water, and everybody there were homeschooling parents.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I met some people, and they put me in even more groups or things that they felt were more tailored to us.
Mm-hmm.
And my son became friends with a parent, and we decided to keep in touch.
Mm-hmm.
And she was already homeschooling two of her children. And so she was a great resource, still is
Mm-hmm.
today. My son is best friends with her children. And
Mm-hmm.
so the family, the community just started growing from
Wow.
there.
Mhm. Wow. It's like the perfect
Yes.
intertwine
Hmm.
between, community and educating our children and seeing how that work. I know that there's a tendency for many to think that, kids who are homeschooling may not get as good an education, right? Because there's still a lot of doubts about what is accomplished. And so, and I have my own thoughts too. But I'm so curious before I share my thoughts. What would you say to someone
Hmm.
who still doesn't really understand the benefits, especially of homeschooling? Um, what are some benefits you've observed, especially when you compare it to the classroom setting? And especially when you compare it to, what your son he has accomplished or achieved, right? Based on how you measure that. What are some pros?
I would say some of the benefits is being able to go at your own pace. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of times, what I've noticed, particularly in the public school sector, we ask children to do things that they're just not developmentally right for.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Yeah.
some kids can push through and do well with those things, but a lot of kids just developmentally just
Mm-hmm.
aren't ready. And
Right.
so by being homeschooled, I didn't have to force him at 5 years old to write an essay or a
Mm-hmm.
paragraph, right? Because he's not
Right.
ready for that. And
Mm-hmm.
so I just noticed things that we were patient about and waited over time as he got older. Some of those things that it just seemed like he wasn't going to get just began to click.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just like, it would be so nice if we weren't in a rush, right? In
Mm-hmm.
the traditional school world, in a rush for the kids to have this and have that. Because eventually,
Mm-hmm.
as they get older and their brains develop, things just start to click. And
Right.
so if you wait to teach those things, the children actually get them much quicker because
Mm-hmm.
they're developmentally ready for it, as opposed to when we introduce it a little too early.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times the kids do not get it. You're repeating it every year, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, a lot of things I just noticed that if we're just patient, it will just click because they'll be
Mm-hmm.
ready. Um, so
Yeah.
that's one benefit. And then another benefit is just being able to go beyond the four walls as your classroom.
Mm,
Yes,
yeah. Mm,
schools have field trips, but a lot of times they might only have one or two field trips a year, depending on their
mhm,
resources and things of that nature. Whereas
yeah.
starting out, the bulk of our education was field trips, because he was young,
Mhm,
right? So we did a lot of
yep.
things at the museum. We did programs at our local science center, an aquarium.
Mhm,
And, a lot of the museums around here do have homeschool days. So we took
mhm,
advantage of all of those things. And so that was also a benefit to get outside, to
mhm,
learn from other things and places around us, especially at the younger ages. We also
right.
sometimes just did playground pop-ups. There was one group we used to meet at the playground once a week, every week. Even if it was
Mhm,
cold, the children would be out there in their mittens and
mm,
gloves, and they would just have the best time playing with each
right.
other. And so he looked forward to that. That was something that we
Mhm,
did once a week for a good year to 2 years, we did that. So
yeah.
just having,
Wow. Oh my gosh, you said some amazing things there, especially when you talk about the developmental part. I think even as a teacher, um, and even having taught for years and preparing teachers, I don't think that the connection between the emotional and the cognitive, right? I don't know that it really clicked as much as it did until I started homeschooling my son, right? Because then you as a parent, you're in touch with the emotional side and the cognitive side. And sometimes, if you're in a school setting, the focus is on the cognitive side. And even when you try to focus on the emotional side, sometimes, in a big setting, in that type of class, it's still like, what does that mean, right? What is that? I'm so curious as to, from going from a teacher to a homeschooling parent, what kind of aha moments you had even after years of teaching, that you gained from starting to teach your own child?
well, one, it was hard to let go, of some of my teaching upbringing, right? I was an education major. I went through the
Mhm,
whole teaching process. And
mhm,
so it was hard to get away from mimicking school at home, right? Because
mm,
that's not necessarily what homeschool is, mimicking school from home.
mhm,
So just trying to find that medium.
mhm,
And also, like I said, I have a busy child. He likes to be up and moving.
mhm,
So trying to do things differently where it was a lot more motion or through games, which was
mhm,
really hard for me. That doesn't come natural to me. I have other
mhm.
friends, they're like, oh, turn this into a game, or oh, they can move and do this and do that. And I'm like, I just, that just doesn't come natural to me.
Mhm,
But I knew that I wanted to do different things, right? With homeschooling, I
mhm,
did not want to mimic school at home because
mhm.
then otherwise, what's the point? He could just go to school. Um,
Right.
but I think the aha moment was those developmental things that I mentioned to you, when
Mhm,
he was learning to tie his shoe. Not that that's something you would necessarily teach in school, but just
mhm,
even things like learning to tie a shoe or recognize numbers on an elevator and things of that nature. When he
mhm,
wouldn't get it, sometimes it'd be frustrating. Like, I told you that that's the number five. Why can't you remember that it's the number five? Or
mhm,
practicing the tying of the shoe, but really that hand eye coordination wasn't ready yet. Right. And as he
mhm,
got older, I noticed it came quicker. Or if
mhm,
you, even with the numbers in an elevator, wanting to never being able to recognize pushing five, and you're like, oh my gosh, when are you going to see that it's the number five and to push five? And then as soon as you're getting frustrated, and it wouldn't even have been that much time, maybe a few weeks later, he just automatically hits five. And it's just
mhm,
like, I just noticed if you're just patient and just
mhm,
wait, it will click, it will come.
mhm.
Sometimes we're
Right.
just in this rush, like, oh my gosh, why don't you know this? You should
Mhm,
know this. We get on this elevator every day. You should know which
mhm,
one is five to go and press. But I learned in those moments that if you are just patient,
mhm,
sometimes this is as short as 2 or 3 weeks later, it'll just click. Oh, we're on the elevator. This is five. I recognize the number five, or this is where it is on the
mhm,
elevator. It eventually clicked to them. And sometimes you just need to be patient and it
mhm.
will just come. And
Right.
sometimes it comes because of their age or routine, developmentally. Like I said, I just noticed a lot of things as he got older, it just clicked.
Mm-hmm.
Even when it comes to
Yeah.
traditional book work, things as he got older, it just didn't take him as long to
Mm-hmm.
acquire the skill because
Mm-hmm.
he was a little bit older and a little bit wiser and the brain had developed a little bit more. So those are like the
Mm-hmm.
little moments that I just kind of have been discovering along the way.
Yeah. Wow. What what age group and subject areas and tell me a little bit about your teaching. Now that you brought it up, I'm curious, in terms of age group, length of
Okay.
time and things like that. Subject.
Well, I was an elementary ed major.
Okay.
So my certification was 1 through 6 in middle school before they kind of like changed the standards, right? So
Mhm.
I was able to teach from first grade through middle school. But when I first started out, I started off as an elementary teacher. So therefore, I was teaching everything,
Mhm.
all the major subjects.
Mhm.
And then after about 2 years of doing that, I moved to middle school
Mhm.
and I taught sixth grade and I taught language arts. That was
Okay.
my comfort zone.
Mhm.
I, you know, e- I'm a big proponent of math, but growing up, math was just not my jam. And I
Mhm.
always felt insecure about the math.
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
I'm like, okay, great. I love to read. I love literature and things of that nature. So just
Mhm.
being able to just teach English language arts, I enjoyed that.
Mhm.
Um, so I taught sixth grade, I taught seventh grade for about
Mhm.
5 years. And I really developed as a teacher during that time because before then I'd only had 2 years experience. I had
Mhm.
switched school districts. So my first school district, I didn't have a lot of support. The second school district where I taught middle school, I had much more support. I had a mentor. And so I really developed and honed my skills as a teacher. And then from there, I went to teach middle school in Los Angeles.
Mhm.
I was kind of burnt out with my life here and I went to a job fair where they were recruiting teachers. And I didn't have any commitments here. So I just decided to up and move. Everybody thought I was crazy. I did have some family out there. And I also had another fellow teacher that was moving back there. That's where she had grown up. So she became
Mhm.
my roommate. My
Mhm.
college roommate was living out there at the time. So I made contacts with her. So
Mhm.
I probably lived out there for about 2 years. And that first year I taught middle school. I taught English language arts and social studies because out there you either had to teach the English and the social studies or you taught science and math.
Mm.
So I taught language arts and social studies.
Okay. Nice.
And so, yeah, so I taught middle school there. And then, very long story, ended up making my way back to Maryland. But by then,
Mhm.
my teaching certification had expired. So I had
Mm.
to get it renewed. And while I was doing that, I substitute taught.
Mhm.
And when I was substitute teaching, I realized that middle school had changed greatly and I did not want to go back to middle school
Mhm.
at the time.
Okay.
So I ended up back in elementary school, renewed my certification, and got a job teaching elementary school. And that's what I was teaching when I became pregnant with my son and eventually
Mm.
resigning. I left off in elementary school. But during that
Okay.
time, even when I was teaching the middle school, I taught high school, like at
Mhm.
night school, because I always had a part time job. So I taught night
Mhm.
school to kids who had failed English 9 and needed the credits. I've
Mhm.
also taught speech at a community college early
Mhm.
on. So I definitely dipped my toe in the ball.
Mhm. Okay. Awesome. I realize that a lot of times people don't realize that one of the ease of writing is having something to say, right? Sometimes we'll ask students to write something. They don't know what to write, and we don't realize a lot of times it's because you don't have a frame of reference. And field trips, things like that, the experiences are so important and so critical, and it was one of the major reasons that, in his early years, before we started homeschooling, we decided to, okay, we're going to take him out. We had him in public school for a couple weeks. And we took him out and put him in private because, I felt like at that age, kindergarten age, he needed an opportunity for having experiences. But it makes such a big difference. I mean, people don't make the connection between how those affect your writing, right? If you ask somebody to write
Right.
about, I don't know, Statue of Liberty, the person who visited, is going to have a different conversation than somebody who read a page. I'm so curious now that you've done both. If for some hypothetical reason you were to go back into the classroom, the elementary classroom, what would you do differently now? What would you take from your homeschooling experience?
Children, readiness is teaching, and
Mm-hmm.
what's that? Just because a child isn't sitting at their desk doesn't mean they're not paying attention or listening. So
Mm-hmm.
they could have a fidget in their hand and, could be popping things on the fidget. It doesn't mean that they're
Mm-hmm.
not paying attention. Or a child that they
Right.
might just need to stand and listen as opposed to sit. So taking back just even those little nuggets,
Mm-hmm.
even though it's small, it's a big deal because
Mm-hmm.
everyone doesn't learn the same way, which, we all know that. But but when you're in a school setting, you often have a big class. You kind of need a sense of order.
Mm-hmm.
But, if the child that needs to stand up or use their fidget, if they're not bothering anybody else and they're still paying attention to the lesson, what does it hurt? Why do they have to sit? So I would definitely be more understanding
Mm-hmm.
of those kinds of differences in how
Mm-hmm.
children need to listen and learn and receive the information and just
Mm-hmm.
try to curate that as best as I can. Because, you only have but so much power when you're working for someone else, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
as much as
Yeah.
I could lean into that, I definitely would bring in that frame of reference.
Right. Oh my goodness, so interesting you said that. I think people sometimes don't realize that sometimes teachers' hands are tied, especially when they're following rules, that whether or not it makes sense or whether or not it's helpful. Because sometimes, there's a tendency to view a class, if it seems more chaotic as not learning, right? Especially for little kids. I think sometimes teachers, it's even in the elementary, and I have these conversations with my teachers, preparing teachers all the time. It's very challenging to sometimes allow things to be a little messy, right? um,
Exactly.
but you also said something that, you also talked about not realizing the different ways of learning. I realized too, in a course I taught this semester as well, educational psychology. One of the aha moments that some of the students expressed was not realizing that children learn whether or not you intend for them to learn, right? Because the uh, studies talk about intentional and unintentional learning, that occurs and how that occurs, and sometimes they learn even when you're not intending, right? And so that reminded me of that. Um, Let me see. So where are you now in your homeschooling? You said your son is. Are you going to continue the homeschooling into middle school? Are you on the fence? What are your thoughts now?
I would like to homeschool throughout. I've seen
Okay.
families do it and their children
Mhm.
are thriving. They
Mhm.
have now gone on to college, receive scholarships to college. So just because you are homeschooling doesn't mean those things can't happen if that's your path.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
that's the goal. But at the same
Mhm.
time, circumstances change, or my son is really adamant about trying traditional school,
Mhm.
then we'll look at those things then. Because,
Yeah.
I always tell people that whatever journey you have, it doesn't have to be permanent, right? He
Mhm.
could try going to a more traditional school setting and
Mhm.
realize it's not working. Then we just go back to
Right.
homeschooling. So,
Mhm.
it doesn't mean that you have to, just like when people aren't happy with their job, they look for something that will fit them better.
Mhm.
So it would
Right.
be the same thing with the homeschooling. But, I would
Mhm.
like to. I feel like more and more, like I said, more and more families are choosing homeschooling. So therefore, there are
Mhm.
more resources and
Right.
things available. So as he gets older, obviously when he gets older, like 11th and 12th grade, right, you had the opportunity to do dual enrollment, right, where he could be
Mm.
taking his some classes at the community college. We had that. But then even
Mhm.
before then, there's different learning centers or tutorials where he could go 1 or 2 days a
Mhm.
week for specialty classes or things of that nature, especially as he gets older, there are just more things out there. Now,
Mhm.
unfortunately, sometimes I notice that some of the programs that I'm interested in aren't local, right? So
Mhm.
then we're driving 45 minutes to an
Mhm.
hour, depending on
Mhm.
traffic, right? To get
Mhm.
certain places. So that is kind of like my only hiccup. But
Mhm.
is that I noticed that some of the things that I know I will be interested in as he gets older are a little distance from
Mhm.
us. And we've
Yeah.
we've we've
Mhm.
driven for different opportunities before, and it can be taxing always on the
Yeah.
highway. So
Mhm.
I'm hoping that some more opportunities become available locally. But like I said,
Mm.
also you have to be careful because sometimes you have people who are starting something, but it's not always the best thing.
Mhm.
So I do notice that in the
Yeah.
homeschool sector, you do have to be careful. People want to market
Mhm.
towards
Mhm.
homeschoolers because they know more and more families are homeschooling, but
Mhm.
everything that's marketed isn't great.
Mm-mm. Absolutely. Well, that's great. You're keeping it open and, also based on his needs. Um, and I remember we had chatted about that. So based on his needs and his wants. Um, so I am so curious. I do want to talk about your book, but I do have another question for you. When it comes to, having had this vast experience, and I've talked repeatedly, about educating our boys and educating Black boys in general. Um, what do we need? What do we need in no, let's first talk about what do we need in general and what do we also need that's missing that we don't necessarily get in the school system. So start with what do we need in general?
I think we need in general, especially during those early years, is
Mhm.
to have more movement.
Mhm.
A lot of times, I mean, girls too, but a lot of times it's more
Mhm.
boys so than girls having a lot of energy and a lot of movement.
Mhm. Yeah.
And, they don't have a very long recess in the
Mhm.
public school sector. And then because
Mhm.
there aren't a lot of consequences, I know usually that's the first thing teachers take away, right? Is as
Mhm.
a discipline, is because they
Yeah.
don't really have a lot of things they can do. But
Mhm.
somehow structuring, I wish that there could be a longer recess. If you look at a
Mhm.
lot of these private schools, when the
Mhm.
children are in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, they have a lot of opportunity outside to rip and run. You know,
Yes, they do.
they might start off with that first thing in the morning. Right. They
Mhm.
might start off that first thing in the morning and then sit and do work for an hour or two, and then they may have another opportunity. And
Right.
they still, manage to have rigorous learning and things throughout the
Yep.
day, but they realize that boys need to move, they need to have that physical activity. And so
Mhm.
I just, wish that is something that could be brought in the public sector and not look at it as, oh, well, then they're taking away time from learning. But they
Mm.
might actually learn more if they
Mhm.
could get that energy out. So
Mhm.
bringing that back to the public sector, I think would be great.
Mhm.
Also, just having more help in the classroom. A lot of
Mm.
times we have to cut funds,
Yeah.
and I think during those developmental, when children are learning to read, learning how to
Mhm.
sound out words phonetically and things of that nature, you need, depending on how many children, every
Mhm.
child abilities and group.
Mhm.
You're human.
Mhm.
It's just hard. But I
Yeah.
feel IEP at the very beginning, you had 2 or 3 adults in the room,
Mhm.
and kids could get more of that one on one for those
Mhm.
developmental skills,
Yeah.
for learning how to do syllables and sound out words and
Mhm.
learning to read and to be able to read fluently.
Mhm.
That is very hard to do in a class of 35 with one adult. So I wish that I could bring those types of resources into our public
Mhm.
school sector so that in that kindergarten, first grade, second grade, even third grade, we are having multiple adults in the room, not just for an
Mhm.
hour.
Right.
all day, you know,
Mhm.
to help with those developmental skills. Because once children learn to read and learn how to sound out words and do those things, then they can take ownership of a lot of their learning on their own
Mhm.
because they know how to read. They know
Mhm.
the basic skills. They know the basic skills. They can do a lot of learning and teaching themselves because they already know how to read. I feel like that's the thing that I really honed in on my son was
Mhm.
you have to learn to read, learn to read, learn to read, learn to read. Because I feel
Mhm.
like once you learn to read, you can do a
Mhm.
lot more things.
Yeah. You know, oh my gosh. Well, there are a couple of things that I'm thinking about based on what you said. I still, it's the classroom sizes, right? At these public schools. And for years I've been hearing this and I'm still hearing it. Um, even when they put more money into the system, the classroom size, especially in public schools and especially in Black public schools, we know it's not getting smaller, right? We know that, and again, because we had our son in a private school when he was younger, when COVID hit. um, I wasn't worried, right? For a lot of reasons. One, initially they went Zoom live, and two, had the opportunity to go back early because the private school, they had space. And so they divided up the classes into smaller classes, right? Where there were 6, 7 students spread out in a class. Now I know in public school you have more kids, but a lot of times, I don't really know how we think about it. And the help and having, not having that help, that was a big issue too. That it's very hard to get a whole lot done if there's one teacher to that many kids. I mean, I think elementary age, I think 25 kids is a lot. Even if, sometimes people think, oh, well, 25 is small. No, in an elementary class, I, for example, could not, it's funny because for the couple of weeks my son went to that public school, he loved it. For all the wrong reasons. He thought it was a blast. Because he was fairly quiet, the good boy. It was very easy. He could read and he was ahead. It was very easy to, because, like, I was just like, wow, you're not learning anything. You're just getting worse, the learning, what's happening. So, and even when I think about the recess, and I've said this before, I'm going to say it again, what I observe and like you observed in the private school sector, or even I imagine in predominantly white schools, the kids have more recess, right? You realize they went back to school, they needed to have more recess. They had it kind of like the chicken and the egg thing, right? You saw they were bouncing off the roof no matter what color they are, but one had recess and one had more managed classes right back and didn't have the opportunity um to, let's just say, unwind from the experience of being in the home all the time, right? From being locked up in COVID. And so, you know, how we think of this developmentally for different students and who we give recess to, based on our observations, and who we don't give recess to, I think it's needs to be an ongoing discussion. Um, but you coming out of this experience, you wrote a book. And I did have the opportunity to read the
Yes.
book. If you can tell us the name and what the book was about. I enjoyed reading the book, and I don't want to give it away or anything yet, but I just want to have you talk about the book, and I'll tell you what I liked.
Okay, great. So the book is called Prescott's Homeschooling Journey, The Beginning,
Mhm.
and it's based on our first year as a homeschool family. So the book is basically about a boy named Prescott who learns he's going to be homeschooled, but he doesn't know what homeschooling means. So throughout the book, he's learning what it's going to mean for him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So
do you have a physical copy to show people? Go ahead.
I do. This is the book. This is the cover. And
Awesome.
my illustrator was also a homeschool student. She was 15 at the
Oh.
time
Mm-hmm.
that she illustrated this book. It was very important for me to have a homeschooler as the illustrator just to kind of show what homeschool looks like through the years. And, art
Mhm.
is her passion. So this was her first time doing something like this. So it was great for her.
Mhm.
And
Awesome. That's great. The 15-year-old got to be illustrator. That's awesome. I do love how you took us on that journey through, his doubts and wondering, what this is, especially when he looks around and compares himself. And then when he gets to that realization, understanding, it's like, oh, okay. This is, this works. This is fine. So that's awesome. You took us through that emotional journey. Let's see. I'm pausing because I can cut pauses out just to let you know I can cut things.
okay. Okay.
So what else do I want to ask you? Field trip. Okay. So one of the things that I know that I'm curious. One of the things that you said is you're keeping it open as to whether to send him back. And I do have to say, from my own observations, I've met, um, it's hard to say how many homeschooling students, but I know I'm thinking of one in particular. She stood out to me. Um, because I really, from talking to everyone and seeing how our homeschooling students do, I think that, they do better. They do better at home. Those who choose to stay. And I think those who then choose to go on do well as well. Because one, you can't beat the one and one, right? One, two, you get to fill in, not even fill in, you get to go on this journey without having these gaps because this learning is catered to you. And I did, put my son back in the public school. And so far I'm happy. He's doing well. There are things we look for, emotionally and how our students are doing. We want to know if they want to learn more or they come back wanting to learn mess, right? Are they more chaotic, less chaotic? Things like that. Especially as a parent and a homeschooling parent who is a teacher, those are things you'd look for. Um, you know, Motivation level, is there gaps? You're starting to get gaps and things like that. Are there any additional concerns that come up for you that maybe make you hesitate? And I know, and it's again, every situation and context is different, but I'm just curious as to what comes up for you. Hmm.
The
Hmm.
school, is that what
Yeah.
you're referring to?
Yes.
Sometimes being, not that this can't happen as a homeschool student, but I feel like him getting caught up in finding other things, uh,
Mm.
valuing other things,
Mm.
or making other
Gosh.
things more important.
Hmm.
That peer pressure. I mean, and I know he's going to get peer pressure regardless,
Hmm.
right? But I do
Right.
feel like it will come quicker and more opportunities of that if
Hmm.
he's
Yeah.
so that that is one of my hesitations. I feel like, just like your son, you said when he went, he was like, oh, this is good, but for all the wrong reasons, right? I think my child's reason means for sometimes wanting to go are for the wrong reasons, right? And
Mm.
he doesn't understand what I understand or what
Hmm.
I've experienced through my age, right? Kids see
Right.
things through their eyes, and so they don't see things through the parent eyes, or they don't see the long-term effects of what they want.
Hmm.
So
Absolutely.
and granted, you do have to learn to get along and work and be around different kinds of people, which,
Hmm.
I find that in our homeschool circles, he is around different types of people. But
Hmm.
he also plays sports and extracurricular activities with children that go to traditional school, right? So he
Hmm.
is still, around all kinds of people and different people who don't all go to school like him. But I do
Mm.
feel that, especially during those younger years, when you homeschool, I feel like you can kind of curate who your children become friends with, right? Because you
Mhm,
kind of dictate who they're around.
mhm,
And tend to be, when you're homeschooling, you tend to be around more like minded people,
mm,
people that are more like yourself. Yes,
mhm,
my friendships in my homeschool community were all different, but then there are certain
mhm,
things that are all the same, or that we value that's the same, or that we
mhm,
do that are quite similar with our children. And so, I think about all of the really good friends he has,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
I kind of curated that environment. I have less control if he's
Mhm.
in a traditional school, right? About who
Yeah.
he's around and to curate that. Now, granted,
Mhm.
eventually he is going to have to make these decisions on his own. But I think
Mhm.
the advantage of those younger years is being
Yeah.
able to curate that. So,
Mhm.
that would be
Absolutely.
another concern that I
Mhm.
would have.
Yeah. Wow. That is so wow. Yep, I have I definitely relate. What are some things you want him to value that you think is important for him
I want him to
and in general?
value
Mhm.
himself, right?
Mm.
Our world is very hard. No
Yep.
matter what type of school or education you have, life is
Mhm.
hard, life is tough, right?
Mm.
So I want him to have great self-esteem. I don't want
Mm.
him to fall prey to wanting to be like or having to have something similar or do something similar if you feel deep down that something isn't right or that you
Mm.
shouldn't do it. I want him to
Yeah.
have the confidence to stay
Mhm.
away from those things that you know it's wrong. And I know it's
Right.
hard, right? As a child, all of us make mistakes, but overall, what
Mhm.
is the path you're going to take?
Right.
And, just being confident and and appreciating what you have, because
Mhm.
even in the book,
Mhm.
towards the end when he's on the playground, when people are
Mhm.
asking him, well, oh, you're homeschooled, he feels a little shy about it, right?
Mhm.
And then at the end of the book, he proudly admits to the other kids on the playground that he's homeschooled. Well, that's
Mhm.
that confidence I want. If
Mhm.
you're homeschooled, don't be shy about it. Be
Mhm.
proud. There are other kids, you might feel self conscious to say you're homeschooled in front of a group of kids who have to say they go to this school, that school, whatever, but they might be
Mhm.
looking at you and
Mm.
be envious of you. Like, wow, you're homeschooled? What's that mean? You get to stay in your pajamas? Do you not have to get up early? Like, I tell
Yeah.
him all the time that people are probably envious of you. So be
Mhm.
proud that you're homeschooled, just like the character at the end of my
Mhm.
book is proud and looks,
Mhm.
so I just want him to have those attributes as he grows older and
Mhm.
might be more influenced by things. I still want him to
Right.
have that confidence and to
Mhm.
appreciate the life that you have and be
Mhm.
proud of the things that you have and that you've accomplished
Wow.
without worrying about what that other person doesn't have or doesn't do or what have you.
Absolutely. That's a huge one. Valuing himself. Valuing himself. Oh my gosh. There's just so much we're bombarded with that says otherwise, right? It's not just in school, it's in society, it's on TV. I find it so fascinating the arguments that come up um on TV, especially when people say, "Oh, schools are XYZ." It's like the chicken and the egg thing, right? Like which comes first? You have schools within the context of our society, right? Whereas sometimes we think of, "Oh, it's society within the context of school." I guess it's, you know, which comes first and which is influencing which and why. Um it's really hard to escape it, I find, in school and out of school, especially now with social media and internet and, and all of those things. But yeah, the beauty of, like you said, of homeschooling is that you do get to direct that and limit that a little bit. Some of the things that they're exposed to, with even, with friends, right? And sometimes even with friends at school or even even friends that he's known. For my son is known, who might be just have other values and exposed to other values, right? Awesome. So what do you want to leave the audience with?
I guess I would want people to know that homeschool children are just children, right? And that homeschool is just another path to education. I
Mhm.
find that sometimes people treat homeschooling as different. They always want to
Mhm.
know when you're going to put your child back in school and things of that
Mhm.
nature. But I want people to look at
Mhm.
homeschool as just another type of schooling, just like you have
Yep.
kids in private school,
Mhm.
religious schools, and the public school. Homeschool is just
Mhm.
another entity of that. And I eventually would like us to get to that, like, where it's
Yeah.
looked at, oh, private, religious, public, homeschool. Like, and,
Mm.
that is the same,
Mm.
even it's just different, right? A religious school is going to be different than a child at the public school. So,
Mhm.
homeschool is just that another piece of education. Just like
Mhm.
with the book, I want other people. Yes, it's called Prescott's homeschooling journey, but it's about a boy's journey.
Mhm.
It could easily be a boy's journey into that he's going to go to boarding school, right? And
Mhm.
then what is boarding school?
Mm.
Homeschool is just another entity. So even if your child is not homeschool, if you have a child who loves children's picture books, this is still a book you can enjoy, even if you're
Mhm.
not a homeschool family, because we
Right.
have our children read other books and learn about other cultures and people all the time. So just because
Absolutely.
this is homeschool, what makes it so different?
Mhm.
So, you
Wow.
know, I feel like, it shouldn't be looked at as such this different thing. Oh, I don't homeschool my child. Oh, that's nice. You wrote a book, but I don't homeschool my child. So, but you read
Mm.
about Diwali, even if you're not East Indian, right? Or you read
Mhm.
about children celebrating Kwanzaa, even if you don't
Mhm.
celebrate Kwanzaa or Hanukkah, just so that your child is more well rounded. I feel like it's the same with the whole neighbor
Mhm.
might.
Mhm. Wow. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Listening to that brings up so much for me. Absolutely. Wow. It's interesting you said that. It's almost as if if you're in a school setting, would you be open to home reading about homeschooling, right? And what level of openness do you have for something that's different? And if there's hesitancy, where's that hesitancy coming from, right? I find that sometimes we sometimes our identity is attached to schooling so much that, we're a little less open to other things. Um, and I don't even know if it's so much schooling as, our identity is so attached to what society values, right? Um, and it makes us less open to being able to value others. I'm actually I'm kind of I'm doing some what's the word? I want to say research on values, which is kind of so interesting you said that. Um and valuing ourselves so important. Um so important. All right. Well, thank you so much. This was an amazing conversation. Anything else you want to say or any other takeaways for folks?
Well, just thank you for inviting me on. This was a very great conversation, like you said. And I just would want folks to, support support me as an author.
Mhm.
Eventually, this book was supposed to be and still plans on being a series, hence which is why it's called The Beginning, right? So
Mhm.
the it was supposed to be, Prescott's homeschooling journey, the beginning, then Prescott's homeschooling journey, the something else and something else.
Mhm.
Um, but as you know, being an author, unless, you have the big publishing companies behind you or you're a celebrity, it's very hard
Mhm.
to promote and make your book sellable and successful, right?
Mm.
So
Yeah.
in a children's book, you have to have pictures. You got to pay an illustrator. So it's not cheap
Mhm.
to uh, self-publish your own book. Hence why the sequel or the second book about Prescott has been a little delayed. But, so just support self-published authors in general. They need it. We need it. So that we can keep uh, productive material.
Now, where would they find your book? Okay.
Yep.
And
Right on
you said the
Amazon.
ebook is available as well, right?
The ebook is available well through Barnes and Noble. If you go on Barnes and Noble's site and you type in Prescott's homeschooling journey, the option for the ebook pops up as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Miss Tara Harrison. I appreciate you joining me for another week of Learning for Truth and Love. And if you like this episode, please like it and please subscribe to hear other episodes. Thank you.